Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here in Perth and a real honour to be here for your discussion of the energy futures of Australia and the world, I hope. I'm going to give you a bit of a rave about the past as a prelude to those futures so that you can sort of start thinking about the change that's upon us in the energy industries of the world as you get into the conversation about workforce development needs, skills training and all the good work that you do. So that's the kind of context of my talk as your international guest speaker. I'm trying to give you the history thus far of electricity in the 21st century. But before I get into it, I actually want to ask you to get all those devices out of your pockets and into your hands. I know that's contrary to most speakers' wishes, but I know you've got them, so you're going to get stuck into them anyway during the talk. And you can use this presentation platform called Zeetings, zeetings.com/DannyKsFun, and you can engage with me if you will. So pull them out, pull up your browser, log on. You can take the presentation that I've got away with you as a result of that, and you can also do some questions for me while we go. We're going to sort of talk about some topics that I think will be interesting just to see what the crowd's view is and what the thinking of your industry as the trainers of the energy workforce of Australia is about the nature of electricity today. So please go to this website, zeetings.com/DannyKsFun. Just while you're logging onto that, bit of background to complement what Phil just mentioned. Sungevity is now one of the world's top residential solar service businesses. We are here in Australia as well, have been for a year and a half now. Recently we employed a bloke who many of you might know to run the company in Australia. The CEO is James Myatt, Jim Myatt of Jim's team, the Australian power and gas guy, who built that company from scratch, was its CEO as a public business until it sold to AGL a year and a half or so ago. Jim, as an example of the change that's going on, I think is a great story. Obviously, he started as an apprentice on the lines in Victoria. Some of you might have maybe known him back then. Built Duke's business in Australia and lots of other great enterprises in the energy space, and is now working for a missionary solar company called Sungevity, which we're very proud of and very glad to see him join the team at Sungevity. Globally, we're in the States, as was mentioned. We have about 500 people directly employed in Oakland, California, and probably another 1,000 around the country doing installs for us any day of the week. But we subcontract the installation. That's part of our business model. I won't go on too much about Sungevity, but just to give you the background. And then we're also in Europe and based out of the Netherlands there, going across the continent in partnership with E.ON, which is an interesting story also, in the sense that we're now partnered with the world's largest customer-facing utility, E.ON. If any of you know it, it has about 26 million customers around the globe, and we've become sort of, through an investment they made in us, their solar service department in some markets, and are rolling out rooftop residential solar service with them, which is indicative, I think, of the change that's coming. So anyway, hopefully with that little background, you've got onto zeetings.com/DannyKsFun, and you can answer this first question for me, which is you get to press an A, B, or C button online. And I just want to know what you think is happening in the world of energy and electricity particularly, and how much new global power capacity was renewable in 2013. So these are new additions to the global grid. I'm asking you guys what you think was the sort of ballpark. Was it greater than 10%? Was it greater than 30%? Was it greater than 50% of new additions to the global grid? So you can see the interactive real-time Zeetings technology working. It's kind of fun. I don't know what the N of this sample data is, but you're all having a flurry, and that's the point of this. And it seems like there's sort of an emerging consensus that people think about a third of electricity additions globally were renewable last year. Some people still think it's lower and around 10, probably most other people, and then some think it's over 50. Well, the real number is indeed 58% of new additions to the global electricity grid last year were clean energy, for want of a better word. Just 42% were coal, oil, nukes, or gas in the year 2013. It's a big shift from 2001, so this is where my history lesson starts. We began the century at about 80% of all new additions in any given year in any given market being fossil fuel-based technologies, largely. A bit of water boiling by nuclear technology, but largely we did electricity like we did in the 20th century at the start of the 21st century. We burnt stuff to boil water to drive a turbine that was invented about 150 years ago by Faraday et al. And that's how we've done it. And it's always been pretty consistent, right? The history of electricity has been, most new ads have been built around that water boiling business, the steam business, as it were. That was the case at the start of the century. But look at what's happened in this century. So far, we're 15 years in or so, and it's a dramatic sea change in electricity. We've gone from a steady state of every year when you do something new, some new country gets a grid, someone else gets electricity service in a new market, that's probably going to be fossil fuel based. That's plummeted from its average for 100 years of around 80+% to less than 50% in 2013. The crossover year was 2012, and I think in the history books, when we really write the 21st century history, not just 15 years through it, but 100 years from now, we'll look back at that turning as a very, very significant economic moment, because electricity changed from being this thing built around a central station, hub and spoke model, with all that that portends for our urban planning and our industry and our business and our workforce development and our skills needs, to a distributed architecture, one in which electricity was built closer to the point of use, mostly at the point of use, certainly in between load centers and supply, certainly around a bidirectional grid rather than this sort of hub and spoke central station fire hose model that we've inherited. This is the actual numbers built up by IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. It's not me making it up. And I got to stress, if you remember anything from this talk, it's that trend line. This is a crash. This is not a blip. This is a phase out. After 150 years of doing it one way, we've taken 15 years to stop doing it that way. Doesn't matter what the politicians tell you, doesn't matter what Joe Hockey goes to China and tries to convince them to do, the trend line is terminal. We're getting off coal, oil, nukes and gas very dramatically. In a 150-year-old industry, 15 years of rapid transition like that is a plan. The community has spoken, whether it's by consumer demand, investors' dollars, businesses built. It's no longer going to be the way it was done. It's going to be a different way. And that way is the blue line, which has come up from almost zero to hero at 58% and more going forward. Okay, with that said, another question for you. You get to engage again, which is, okay, at rates of growth like that, you know, and this is where we get into the crystal ball business, and I don't like doing this so much because forecasts are fickle, and we're really talking about economic forecasts, and as you know, economists are the dismal scientists and worst of all at this business, but let's try it. Let's say where we think we'll be 15 years from now. As a matter of all global power capacity. So this isn't just new adds to the grid in the year 2030, but as a function of the grids, what do you think we'll have? Will we have still, you know, a minority renewable or clean energy, maybe a third clean energy, over half clean energy, or even more? Remember, this is 15 years away. It's not a long time, really, in the history of energy. When you build a nuke, it takes about 15 years. When you build a coal plant, it probably takes 2/3 of that time. When you build solar power plants, obviously you can put gigawatts up in months, as the Chinese did this year. You know that they've built as much solar as Australia has in the first 6 months of 2014 on rooftops in China. But still, with that said, those rates, where are we going to be? Okay, people are getting pretty bullish. We're seeing the future is renewable. 50%, I think it's over 50%, or more than 50% do, according to the slides. And indeed, that is where the professional forecasters think it's going. This slide, it's a little bit hard to read, I apologize for that, but the two pie charts are global capacity. One in 2012, just a couple of years ago, when we had about 5,500 gigawatts of power capacity on Earth. And the other one, my left, your right, is in 15 years, 2030, the projection of Bloomberg is that we'll be at about 10,500 gigawatts. Remember, Australia has, what, 50 gig of capacity or less, I think, total in the system. So we're less than 1% of the current, let alone future grid capacity. But that build out, you know, that's conjecture because it's future. Others, I know GE pretty well, they invested in Sungevity. I know they think it'll be 13,500 gigawatts of capacity globally. Whatever, 10,500, 13,500, big number. We're going to double power supply in the world in 15 short years, right? Most of that is in China, Southeast Asia, India, and Africa. And most of that is going to be clean. And by the end of that period, most of capacity on Earth, because there's such a big build-out over the next 15 years, is going to be in renewables. If you look at the segments of the growth over that period, you've got solar there at less than 2% of the small pie, right? At 5.5 gigawatts today or yesterday in 2012, we were less than 2% of supply. 15 years hence, they're projecting we're close to 20% of supply. That means a 10x growth in a $100 billion business already in 15 short years. So if it portends anything for you and your businesses, it's put on your seatbelts. This is a rocket ship taking off. Renewables go crazy. There's very few industries that employ as many people as we already do that will go through that kind of growth curve. In fact, I can't think of any except maybe the meth labs of Victoria after watching Four Corners last night. The wind power industry doubles, the rest of renewables double, but solar pretty much 10x's in 15 years. Nukes pretty much dies. Fossil fuels are kind of going into a terminal decline if you look at those numbers. And this is not me, this is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, but Michael Bloomberg was running around New York using this graph. That's where I got it a month ago at the Climate Week at the UN, because this is what they seriously think they can argue is being built with known bond issuances, debts, and other things taken on board to finance this build-out. So it's a pretty decent representation of what's likely to happen. And again, I think that offers you a great insight into where you need to be thinking and preparing for the future of energy. So how did this happen? I'm going to give you a bit of an economics lesson, and forgive me if it's redundant. I overuse one slide a lot because it's another one of those images that I want you to go away with burned into your retinas. And it's basically this story in a couple of different graphs. The history of the solar panel, a machine that's driven by a technology curve, not by a scarcity curve, which is the rule of economics that electricity has historically been governed by. But now we're going to become a technology industry. Semiconductors made of silicon get cheaper the more they're manufactured. We know that from mobile phone stories. In my lifetime, it's gone from 77 bucks a watt, this is out of The Economist, to 77 cents a watt. This machine that when you stick it in the sun produces the thing we value called electricity. No fuel input required, no waste product necessary, no moving parts, nothing, just electricity. That machine has gone from 77 bucks to 77 cents in my lifetime. Another representation of that per kilowatt hour, which is really what matters, right? What you pay at the plug. And through time, solar, since it was invented in 1954, has become less expensive because every doubling of volume of that manufacturing, it's dropped basically 18% in price. And so the price of the plug has come down through time. The big knee in the curve is when China got into the game. And they're only just beginning. They've only just started mass manufacturing this puppy. Like I said, last year they decided to actually install it in China. Previously it was an export-only market. This year they're going to do 13 gigawatts of solar installations. Second year of the business in the domestic market, and they're going to do more than humanity had done by 2010, when this technology was 50 years old. So this business is just beginning, and that curve is just starting to cut through. The fossil fuel curve on the other side is simply the rule of scarcity. When you have a finite thing, water and fuel, and you use it more, it becomes more expensive. You understand that as an economic rule. That's what's happened with fossil fuel-based electricity, so it goes up through time. And about 2012, which not coincidentally was the year we did the crossover, that became cheaper than most power in many key markets around the world in terms of what you pay at the plug. Now, I'm celebrating this with the big orange splashy slide because you can tell where I'm coming from. I like this stuff. I think it's a necessary transition we're about. For others, not so much fun. Here's the same curve represented in an analyst report from Wall Street just about 6 months ago. You don't see the top of the curve because of the timeline involved, but The streak coming in from the sky is the price of solar in dollars per MMBTU, which is a different measure than price per kilowatt hour, but pretty much the same story, right? The Henry Hub and all these other markets for fossil fuel-based power supplies are being disintermediated, dissected, disrupted by this Deus Ex Machina coming in from the sky and cutting through their profitability in the year 2012. And if you were in that business, or you owned that business, more importantly, the one that creeps up from the bottom, slowly trickling up, and you concentrated your wealth and power in that game, then you see this as a threat, which is why this version of this slide is called Welcome to the Terror Dome. I kind of enjoyed the fact that some analysts on Wall Street see it as that. It is scary, it's massive change, it's a disruption, according to the New York Times about a month ago, the likes of which electricity has never seen. I can't get over this. The main thing you guys have to prepare your constituencies for is change. The change is going to be dramatic and constant for over a decade. The growth is going to be crazy. My business, we've doubled every year. That's kind of hard. We could do more if we could just hang on to our hats. But you know, when you're doubling annually, and we're now talking a couple $100 million business going towards billions of dollars worth of business just a few short years from now, it's kind of difficult to manage all the systems, the HR, the people stuff. That is the story of electricity on the clean energy side of the ledger going forward. It's an inevitable transition. It pairs with something that I believe you talked about a bit yesterday in the prep sessions. The combination of solar plus storage becomes very interesting and really changes the game. I mean, you talk about disruption. Once you have the potential of defection, as it's called by some, from the central station grid systems, then things are really interesting. But basically, batteries, battery chemistry, storage by another name, are kind of largely driven by the same sort of technology curve as photovoltaics themselves. So once you overlay the two, you start to see crossovers in different markets, and you start to see a huge growth opportunity for solar and storage, which is where we play at Sungevity and want to play more, and where if you guys are going to stay in the game and get people prepared for this world, they need to be working in this distributed architecture, distributed energy and storage set of solutions. One last crack at this slide, just to make sure it sticks in your head. It's an analogy to microprocessing, because like I said, it's the same technology curve, the thing that we call Moore's Law, the semiconductor made of silicon that is what we wrote integrated circuits onto to power computers, made the business of computing basically different, completely different. For those of you that don't know, a computer was once a room full of people working abacuses and otherwise crunching numbers. That's actually what the word comes from. It was a big room. Imagine a bunch of secretaries sitting at cubes crunching numbers. That's what we needed to do to run books and do accounting and calculate stuff. And then we wrote code and hardwired it into microprocessors and engineered them onto silicon chips, so much so that this thing now has more computing power than NASA had when we put man on the moon, right? And it gets better every year for less because of this technology learning curve. Now, microprocessing power, computing power, is so cheap that it's virtually ubiquitous. We've got it in glasses. I've got a pair of shoes that conform to my feet when I run. You can put intelligence into anything because of the lower cost computational thing. And it's put the business of abacus-based accounting out of business. I'm not saying that that is the future for electricity, but the old ways of doing electricity, that power, which we all need, and even more people on Earth that don't currently have it deserve it as a right, will be done very differently because of this semiconductor made of silicon called the solar cell. Another reason why is it's simply more elegant. Something about technology is that it tends towards the simpler, better solution. And when you think about it, we all use solar energy. Pretty much every system is based around it. You could even argue nukes is a form of stardust being captured to boil water today. But solar energy is the basis of the fossil fuel energy system too. It's just it was 200 million years ago that it fell to Earth. Then it was taken up by plants in photosynthesis. Then those plants died. We dig them up today. We burn them with all the byproducts to boil water, which is kind of crazy given water scarcity issues on Earth, to run this thing we call a turbine, which we generally put out of sight, out of mind, because it's pretty messy, and then we shunt electrons down the wire to the end user. Again, compare that to that, and you understand why we win this transition in the long and maybe not so long term. So what do we do at Sungevity? Just to give you a little sense of that, I think on one of the slides before I had 3 phases of industry development. We believe there was a period of hardware focus. That was the first 50 years. There's been a period, about a decade, of getting the financing of that hardware right, because we made the mistake as an industry of asking people to buy their electricity up front in the first instance, whereas electricity is a service, and so you really need to finance it through time. So PPAs were developed in the early 2000s, solar leases, which is what my business does mostly in the US, allowing people to pay as they go for electricity. And then after those industry stages, it really becomes all about the customer. The customer is always right. Electricity doesn't like to think about its customers much. We call them connections in the utility industry. We kind of don't worry too much about them because they are captive. In the States, they're monopoly markets that we get granted as utilities in most places. So there's not a big customer focus, but we believe the future of distributed electricity is all about the customer. So we're about a great customer experience. We sell Sunshine Online, we call it. We use the internet and the telephone to make the sale, even to do the design and engineering. We can size and design a system anywhere on Earth using satellite and aerial photographs. That's a technology platform that we built here in Australia with a wonderkin from Sydney. And then we service those customers through life with an internet portal, a monitoring interface that is fully transparent to them, so they know that they're getting more than what they paid for, and that we keep them happy and engage with them in a snowball of business wherein they share this with their friends on their social networks and stuff, and they go and get us more customers. And so we're building a business basically by referral, word of mouth from various channels, including mostly our customers who have a very high propensity to refer us. Our Net Promoter Score, which is a measure not many in the electricity industry study, but it's the key industry in customer service businesses around the world, our Net Promoter Score is in the 70s. Apple is in the 60s. Amazon's in the 60s. Most utilities have a negative Net Promoter Score. A Net Promoter Score is basically your promoters, people who would likely refer you to their friends and neighbors, subtracting, and you subtract from them your detractors, and you get a net number. And like I said, most electricity service providers in the world currently trend negative in the likelihood to refer, which is why churn is so high in the electricity industry in Australia, as an example. So that's what we do. It's just a story to tell you as trainers and people thinking about workforce development that customers have to become front and center of whatever it is, the curriculum, the work that you're doing and developing. But what else is in it for you? Well, before I get into this, I just want to ask you one more question on zeetings.com, just so you can wake up and look at your device with an excuse other than looking at your Facebook. And that is, how many of you have been involved in anything to do with solar, which is my obsession? Have you trained someone to do photovoltaics? Have you done a job yourself? Do you sell them yourselves? I'm not sure the exact makeup of the room, but just trying to get a sense of where we're at in terms of the mix of people that have worked with this technology set. And it's looking about split, which is really interesting. As you all sign on and press your buttons. And that's great. And it makes sense that in Australia, which has the highest market penetration of photovoltaics in the residential market in the world, that would be true, that you've gotten to grips with this to a certain degree. And I think all I've said, if anything, is that you're going to have to do more rather than less of this over time and grapple with it in a whole lot of new applications. Because where I think it goes is obviously more of that, more construction work, more of the installations, and that's a big labour intense opportunity for Australia. Much more labour intense just by the numbers than the dirty energy central station model. About 4 to 7 times as many jobs per kilowatt hour than fossil fuel generation, depending on the renewable energy source you're talking about. Wind and solar are the highest. Solar is about 7 times more labour intense than fossil fuel generation. And most of that is out in the community. It's selling, it's financing, it's doing stuff Sungevity does, and then it's installing, it's doing the construction, the project management, and then the O&M and the maintenance of the systems out in the community. So they're good jobs, can't be offshored. There's not a lot of jobs in manufacturing these products. They're largely automated and going to be more so through time. But jobs, jobs, jobs is one of the stories of photovoltaics, which is a good news story. Goff would have been proud of this industry as a job creation story. In the States, We're at less than 2% of electricity supply, the solar industry. We employ 144,000 people. So that's the solar industry's number last year by a census of jobs. The coal industry in the United States, including miners, about 80,000, falling to about 50,000 as they shut Appalachia down. Railroad workers, about 50% of whom shunt coal and rail in Australia, in the States, and power plant operators number a total of 180,000, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're at over a third of electricity supply in the States. So for a third of electricity, you employ 180,000 people. For less than 2% of electricity, you employ 140,000 people. We do it for less. So we're more labor intensive, we cost less. It's one of the reasons we're going to grow. Politicians love that shit. We do electricity for less and we create work. So that's good. But there's a lot more than just the construction side of it. There's the intelligence required to make this distributed architecture work. Basically, what we're talking about is the choreography of electricity now between thousands of points of light. Like I said, it's no longer 20 power plants and 20 million consumers. It's 20 million prosumers, producers and consumers. This is a bidirectional grid we're going to build. There will be electrons flowing in both ways throughout the grid, and we're going to need to manage the demand on that. The storage is going to become critical, and as I said, the cost curves on that are becoming very attractive. The DG is going to need to be matched by demand response and demand management, and balancing and integrating all that in the system is going to be the ken of the people that you're training and bringing into the industry today. That's a very exciting space. That's full of opportunity. That's full of jobs. It's a very investor-rich space. One stat that I often share with people in the States that are looking to put their money to work in this space is that even though the majority of new additions to the grid last year, as we saw, were in clean energy, the majority of investments in energy are still getting sucked into coal and holes in the ground and big boiling water businesses, because that's kind of what we know and that's kind of what the analysts look for and that's kind of where the banks go. And so while there's that asymmetry, there's an opportunity and money to be made. For investors, it's a target-rich environment, but more importantly, for entrepreneurs, it's a huge opportunity. I've started an incubator in California for solar startups, where we try to help other entrepreneurs succeed. We have about 17 companies in the space, because what we're talking about is something like $1 trillion worth of value creation. Like if you follow that Bloomberg graph and you grow solar by 10x over 15 years, you're doing at least a couple $1 trillion worth of business building. To build $1 trillion worth of businesses, you need 1,000 billion-dollar companies. Having built one that is nowhere near there but is on the path to be a billion-dollar business over 7 years, I know how hard that is. You think about how few billion-dollar energy businesses there are in Australia. We need 1,000 of those in the next 15 years. To do that, you need 10,000 to try, because most will fail. So we need more entrepreneurs. We need more people taking a crack. We need more ingenious applications of everything you know applied to this distributed energy future. And so if nothing else, maybe EOS can do entrepreneurial training as much as it does the skills training that you do. Just a couple of quick slides. How much time have I got, Phil? 10? And I want to do Q&A if you've got questions. Just to give you a few ideas about where I think the opportunities are, I love this business. It's called Big Belly. They're all over the States. It's a garbage can. Whoever thought a garbage can, A, needed electricity, and B, could be smart? But here's a smart-powered garbage can. The solar's on top. It compacts the trash. It carries about 5 times as much garbage as a can the same size. And it calls to be picked up when it's full. And it saves my city of Oakland $60,000 a month because they don't drive around emptying empty garbage cans. It's smart, it's enabled, it's efficient. You think about where we put solar, it allows all these improvements in the quality of life because we don't have to dig into mains power. We can use it off-grid, as in this application, to do things better. The whole bike sharing phenomenon around the world, and if you've been to any major city, you've seen City Bike and the like all over the joint, wouldn't have happened economically except for solar power, because you can't dig into the sidewalks and tap into the mains cost effectively as you put those bike sharing programs out, but they just put the frames on the ground, solar power them, and away you go. Credit card swipe machines and locking gates to share bikes all around the world. These are the ideas that solar power enables. Maybe more importantly, are the 1.6 billion people that don't currently have electricity. It's an amazing number that on Earth tonight, there'll be kids going to sleep, if they're lucky, with kerosene light. Obviously, they've got the indoor air pollution problem to go with that. I'm on the board of a company called PowerHive. We put solar arrays into villages in Kenya. We wire up the homes. We do that for less than the grid could possibly be extended to the county that we're operating in. And the families subscribe by cell phone technology to the power supply, and they prepay for a month of electricity, and they pay less than they would pay for kerosene. So say they're paying 20 shillings, beg your pardon, for kerosene, they would pay 15 Kenyan shillings or something for our electricity supply. Those kids go to bed at night, turning off the electric light, benefiting from that. Their mum's able to charge their phones. They're able to get other appliances, tablets with Android and Ubuntu operating systems. And we also stick a Wi-Fi repeater in the operating system for these systems. So this village goes from not having electricity to having electricity and the internet. And these kids' lives are transformed because of what we all take for granted today. So we're rolling that out. That's going to be a huge build, a huge set of jobs, a lot of skills required for that. Another area that I think people haven't really grokked in terms of where we're going is transport. This is what I offer to those of you in the utility industry and the generators that are facing the massive change, and I know that that's hard and painful for many in the generating industry in particular. But one thing that we can do is migrate from being just about household electricity supplies and our current loads to taking out the fossil fuel boys on the other side of the ledger, which is our transport budgets. We spend about 40% of a family's budget on cars and the like. We spend less than 4%, this is in the States at least, on household electricity. So there's this huge opportunity with the electrification of mobility to capture that market share, and the entrepreneurial opportunity is enormous. We hear a lot about Tesla. I've got a Fiat 500 that's electric. That's cool, but what's really interesting is the electrification of developing countries as mobility becomes a need as much as a right, as tuk-tuks are electrified. The Chinese recently regulated that two-stroke motors are banned on motorbikes around many cities. They're going electric. Millions and millions of electric vehicles are being produced in India. They're doing electric with induction charging vehicles. That's the future of mobility, and again, something for our constituencies to be trained for, to do. So that's where I'm going to end it. Thank you very much. If you want to know more about Sungevity, you can check us out at sungevity.com.au. I keep a website called The Solar Ascent, which just has a lot of these graphs and slides and stories and studies and stuff. If you want to know more about solar and you're as obsessed as I am, it's a good resource. And the incubator that I mentioned is at spuncube.com. You can also contact me at that email address. And really grateful for your work, grateful for what you're doing to train the next generation of the next generation, if I can make that pun, and good on you for doing it. Thank you.
Hello, David Bryan from Central Tape. What's the power rating of your hives in kilowatt hours, and what voltage are you running at for the villages?
They're 50 kW system standard. And you know, I don't know the voltage answer, but I assume it's per the Kenyan standard because we're actually pretty much endorsed by the kind of Rural Electrification Administration equivalent in Kenya and have local debt helping to finance it. And the president of Kenya has actually got behind it because it's rolling into places where they've been promising grid electricity for decades and can't get it. And it's a pretty small operation right now, but it's going to scale pretty quickly. You know, you've probably heard these stories in Tanzania and other countries of, you know, companies I know that have gone from 500 users to 10,000 to 50,000 in 3 years. And that's going to be the next decade in Africa. They're going to leapfrog from not having electricity to having electricity. And a lot of it's going to be facilitated by cell phones, which they didn't have a decade ago. It's kind of cool. But they didn't have telephony a decade ago, and now they all have cell phones. And that's the intelligence that can both manage for the money of it and control it through the cloud. Another question?
Peter Beeson, with EOS. Danny, I like your presentation. You're doing a great job. What do you know about another form of solar energy that we don't hear much about? Is the harnessing wave technology. There was a pilot program here in Western Australia using the, I think it was called Sci-Tech or something like
Yeah.
that. They had the buoys underneath the ocean and harnessing
Yeah.
and pumping seawater and using that. Is that, and it's only another form of solar energy, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that on your radar at all, or have you known of that?
I mean, you know, as a businessman, I don't really tend to work with other technologies outside the flat plate photovoltaics, and I'll tell you why in a second. But as for knowing much about that, I can't say I really do. There was also in Wollongong a wave generator put in the 2003 or 4. You know, I think that technology set has had trouble scaling and commercializing, and venture having fled the scene of clean energy. Ironically, while all this transition's going on, the venture capitalists of the world have sort of gotten out of the game, which is crazy. So I think they've had trouble doing that. I know there's a pretty interesting technology in the East River of New York City, the Hudson, which is turbines underwater. But I'll be honest, you know, I'm clearly obsessive and maybe biased, I'll own that, but I think nothing with moving parts survives 100 years from now. Like, it's a big call, but when we go to 2114, the Electricity Skills Industry Association of Australia will be sitting around talking about things that don't have moving parts. Because why would you? Like, really, at the end of the day, when you've got a flat plate semiconductor that you shine light on and it does the thing you need, you'd make that ubiquitous rather than things that require bits that go bust. And also, I mean, one of the problems with turbine technologies, whether they're wind, water, whatever, is they need, the other scarcity that they have is space. You need to get bigger to get more power. And it's one of the constraints to wind right now. You know, the wind has to go offshore, basically, to get to the scale of the new technology set to make it cheaper to continue to drive down their prices. So anyway, I maybe a little controversial futurism there, but I truly believe we will look back on the 21st century and say, good, electricity was the blessing of the 20th century, really, to generalize it. But it will go from boiling water business, for sure, and likely go from moving parts business to stuff that doesn't require that. Question over here.
Hi, Richard Harvey from AGL. Once again, thanks for your presentation, Benny. That was really fantastic. That's very interesting graphs. I'm just interested a little bit, hear a bit about the idea that once the battery technology catches up and becomes economic, as we can see on your graphs, all of a sudden a homeowner potentially has a whole lot of decisions they can make with a set of solar panels on their roof and batteries about what are we going to do at almost each and every hour of the day. Should I be, at this point, should I be charging my battery? Should I be running my household from the battery? Should I be selling power back into the grid? And is there a process for doing that?
Yeah.
I'm just interested in how you see this playing out.
Sure.
Just, are we going to be handing over a number of decisions to consumers out there with the solar panels on their roof as to what they do with that energy minute by minute through the day?
In a sense, I think we will, and thank you for your question, and you probably know my mate Jim at AGL. The question is sort of around storage and where it takes us as actors in this electricity internet, if you will. And you know, first thing I want to say is I'm very bullish on storage. It's exciting times, but it's not a necessary precursor to massive penetration of renewables. It's evidenced by Germany and other places. You know, we have days in Germany where 75% of the load is being met by solar electricity alone. Then you layer the wind in, and then you have to shed all the base load production. And one thing for AGL's interest is they're experimenting these days in Germany with when they've got that problem of surplus electricity to a nation of 80 million people, like substantial amounts of surplus electricity, they're hydrolyzing water and enriching their natural gas systems. So in Hamburg, for example, they use excess electricity, split the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and put up to 20% additional hydrogen into natural gas pipes, which they think is safe, which was pretty interesting. So effectively, the storage becomes the gas network. You know, like you're storing the surplus electricity you've generated during the day. So storage is coming. There'll be different forms of it. It won't be like lithium ion only. There's not going to be one standard, I don't believe. It'll be more like gas. It'll be like you get an LPG bottle in some places, you get a network in other places. In Japan, you have mini networks built on gas bottles in cities like Tokyo, weirdly. So you'll have different models, maybe pump storage, maybe flywheels and other things trapping the surplus electricity generated during the day, which necessarily means that consumers will be interconnected, or producers will be interconnected. So one of the things I'm careful about is, while grid defection is possible and will be very economically sensible in some markets even soon, like Australia, unless the regulators and the pricing regimes change, I don't think it's necessarily technologically preferable. In Germany, with the Energiegewinde, or whatever they call it, they model not autonomous homes, but energy plus homes. Because, you know, your production from your rooftop is rarely going to match your exact load, and more likely you're going to share it with your neighbors or some storage capacity up the street, or sell it into the grid more generally. So I think, yes, we will be engaged in that production and consumption of electricity game. Will consumers be setting and choosing when to do it? No. I think it'll be more like you set your parameters in the software and the machine decides for you. So like my electric car as an example, it's fully capable of discharging as well as charging, right? It's not currently allowed to do that because of the regs, but I can imagine at some point rolling into my garage in the States, and instead of filling it up because it's night and I don't want to, because that'd be pulling out of the grid rather than off my roof, and there's some day ahead market that I can sell electricity into, I could have set the machine to have said, dispatch down to 70% charge, so I'm sure to get to work and back tomorrow. So sell the electrons at a premium rate right now. And the software knows when to do that and when not to do that. All that intelligence is available today. All those, you know, bidirectional inverters and battery discharging systems are available today. Probably the place we're seeing this the most in terms of uptake is the US military. I'm actually giving a talk on Friday at ADF in Canberra, because their problem in the Australian Defence Forces is the US is doing this. Their bases in the United States mainland, the homeland as they call it, will be off the grid by 2025. Their Navy is running 50% of its fleets on biodiesel in places and doing solar like you wouldn't believe in the forward Marines operating stations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so they're working out all these things. Does the Humvee charge or not charge? Does it discharge to power the Grunts, scopes and sights for nighttime warfare? All those things are determined by the software. So in many ways, sorry for the long answer, but you asked a great question. Half the work going forward is not in the hardware stack, but it's in the software stack to make the interoperability and the operating systems of energy going forward.
Let's take one last question. We'll have to make it.
Danny, Peter Bell from Electrics. Thanks for your presentation. A lot of talk about domestic, but when it comes to commercial, are we seeing facilities, high-rise buildings having either cogen or solar facilities that now enables them to be self-sufficient? And how far away may that be?
Another great question. I went to an amazing building 2 weeks ago in Seattle called the Bullitt Center, which is a building, a 6th-floor office building, very specky Seattle, not skyscraper, but decent-sized office building, produces more energy than it consumes and produces more water than it consumes. That might have something to do with Seattle, where it rains a lot. But amazing, like a living building with all the bells and whistles of a modern office building, co-working spaces, cool cafeteria, the whole deal, surplus to its energy requirement. Got a friend in China, a company called Hanergy, some of you might know. The tallest skyscraper going in Beijing is going to be faced with photovoltaics, CIGS cells. Is that economic right now? No. Does that matter? No. Will it be because of this cost curve? Yes. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter in the sense that it's an architectural element, really. It's like paying for marble facades and you get electricity out of it instead. Looks great. You know, the built environment will have this, and the commercial buildings, yes. I mean, Australia is a bit unusual in that 95% or more of photovoltaics to date have been in the residential space. Whereas, you know, in the States, a third of the market at least is commercial buildings. And are they going to 100%? Not yet. Will they get storage? Yes. Will they work out this ability to arbitrage the value of the electricity they can generate and store? Yes. Building managers like to make money and like to grow the value of their assets. And this is a game they can now be part of. The built environment will change in our perception from being a sink of electricity to being a source. And that's a game change when you think about it.